today. So that's where we're going to leave the pattern for the moment, but we'll come back to it. Now this was an interesting, enterprising thing, but you know when vacuums got to be talked about in textiles? I didn't know. It was like in the 1930s. So we've gone how many years to 1930 without any mention of vacuum, particularly in textiles. And you know, we're getting almost to the point where some of these inventions were still new when I went into business, which is kind of interesting to me because again, I've spent my life chasing water out of the industry because it's the greatest and most harmful thing that we have to deal with, and that's a precious commodity. But I remember when I went to work for Burlington, we had these wash boxes on the mercerizer, and they were called Bray washers. And I'd look at it. The ones on the dye range looked just like them. They were called single-laced washers. Up and down 3 or 4 times and into a nib. The Bray washer, up and down 3 or 4 times into a nib. What in the heck makes it a Bray washer? Nobody knew. This was in 1961 or 2. Years later, I found out that there was a guy, I think he worked at Lima, Lowenstein for Lima. His name was Bray. And he invented the Bray washer. And I said, well, what in the hell did he invent? Up and down into a nib. It had a vacuum slot in the bottom of it, submerged. And when the fabric would go in, it would pull the water through that fabric underwater, so you got this tremendous exchange of liquor and the fabric, as long as it wasn't clogged, as long as the fabric wasn't wrinkled, as long as the fabric wasn't so narrow that all the water was going around the fabric instead of through the fabric when it went across the slot. Guess what? The slot was clogged more times than it was open. So everybody that bought one took them out. Took out the slots, and then you just had a straight up and down washer. But a Bray washer was quite an invention, one of the first vacuum washers, and it was probably in the 40s or 50s, something roughly in that time frame. But that was the earliest use of vacuum that I could find. The early vacuum slots, they weren't too brilliantly made. They'd take a strip of stainless steel and they'd saw a straight slot, right down the middle of it, they'd saw out 1/8 of an inch. I don't know if they even bothered to sand the edges. And you'd run the fabric over that slot, and it would suck the water out, and it was beautiful for about 2 hours, 3 hours. They had inline filters. By that I mean, if you were going to filter at all, you filtered when the slot was running. If you wanted to clean the slot basket, you had to shut the system down in order to get the pressure off of it so you could get to the filter. That was a problem. And they had large pumps and large motors. Problems. Lint. Anybody that had a dye house knew if the vacuum slot had gone near that fabric in preparation, they didn't want to dye it because it was going to have streaks. It had a very small effect on water removal on cotton. Vacuums do. They don't do a whole lot more than a pad. You can squeeze something down on to about 60 to 65%. You can vacuum it to about, on a good day, to 55, not much below that. And the big disadvantage in the earlier ones where you had to stop the whole range off just to change the slot, the filter. So then somebody came up, I can't find anybody's name attributed to the first time sprays were used, but probably was somebody sneezed one day and realized what a big volume of, space he covered when he did that. So they made sprays, and they had nozzles mounted like this. They had a V pattern coming out from them. They put them all the way across, and they sprayed on chemistry. And you could spray on 10%, 20%, 30%. In fact, that's usually what you did. You sprayed on 10 one day, 30 the next, 20 the next, because they didn't have any controls. They just sprayed. They knew they got less on than they did if it padded it, so they sprayed it. They didn't try to dye with this. They didn't try to put on water repellent, but they could put on softeners and things of that nature. The early spray systems. V-shaped atomizers, inline assembly. Best story I love to tell about sprays. It's not nearly as funny when I have to tell it in front of an audience as it was the day I did it in real life. But there was a company, an unnamed company, that the owner had this most ingenious method of training his new employees. He had the machinery company people and the chemical company people do it at ITMA, the International Textile Machinery Show that was held every 4 years. And the way he did it, he would select 4 guys from the weave room and said, your job at the ITMA is to learn everything you can about a sandfurizer. And he picked 4 more guys from the weave room and he said, your job is to learn everything you can about vacuum slots. And he had these committees. And they would walk into your booth and they would look down to see how sandfurizer was spelled. And we need to talk about this. They know how to pronounce it. Well, that group came to our booth, and I had a bit of a reputation then, and my good friend Rick will have to excuse me for this, for being a little bit anti-sprays, because I was selling vacuum slots, okay? And so we're sitting around this table, and this one kid that probably had more degrees than I could count said, Mr. Aldridge, and I said, the name's Preston. He said, well, he just couldn't get out of that because I was, even then I was older than he. And he said, Mr. Preston, why do you dislike spray so much? And I said, it's very simple. I said, fish are very prolific and they make love in water. And he looked at me and he said, Mr. Preston said, I can't go back and tell Mr. what you just said. I said, well, tell him to come down here. I'll tell him. I'd known him a long time. I probably met him when I was 16 or 17. And but that was my problem with sprays. They clogged. And when they clogged, mounted in a straight line like they were, you had a streak. And if you needed to penetrate and you put more pressure on the spray, in a V nozzle, it put on more in the middle than it did on the edges. And in those days, people, you didn't really know how to overlap them, and so they were a problem. Nobody had a system for recycling what you oversprayed. There was no filter, and you had limited penetration. Remember, one of the tests that you're going to run on water repellents is a spray test, okay? That's maybe not a fair word for it, but that's what it's called. Because it's not, as I remember, it was more of a drip, wasn't it? You hang up. In the old days, then you hang up something up there and you dripped it on, and then you look at beat it on you like this, and then you look at the pictures and say, oh my gosh, those wet places are too big, it's a 2 or a 3 or a 1. I know it's more sophisticated than that now, Deanna, but it was a hoot in those days. But now I'm just getting you to the point where sprays started. Okay, they've come a long way, believe me. and you're going to get to look at that. Some of you have already seen it. I couldn't find the first time that maybe we used kiss rolls as a way to get water out of the industry or to put on less chemistry, but I did find a picture too of just what was the earlier kiss roll arrangements, and then we'll look at what's out there today. But that's about as simple as it gets. I think I stole this from a Cotton Incorporated bulletin on VAT printing, by the way, if you kind of recognize that picture.
Looks familiar.
But, you know, the rubber roll doesn't run in the liquor. The steel roll runs in the liquor. And the fabric's fed in from here, goes up like this, and you only wet one side. Now, the only control that particular setup's got on it there is whatever you make the surface of that pickup roll. You can make a gravure roll, you can carve it up somewhere or another. You can leave it absolutely polished, but you don't have much of a control feature in that particular setup, but that was one of the earliest kiss rolls that was used, that arrangement. Again, one roll in the liquid. You could put a doctor blade on it. I forgot about that. We could have put a doctor blade on the early ones. But they were viscosity dependent. There were things that viscosity problems that you could get into. The very little control. They've actually used, as you can guess, more in coating than in. But again, you can make a case for when you were coating some things, you were not using as much water. And there was limited penetration with a kiss roll. And I keep talking about penetration because where you put the chemistry is becoming increasingly more important than ever. And it used to be that we didn't worry too much about where we placed it. We just wanted to make sure we got enough of it on there. But then the chemistry folks realized that, gosh, if per pound of what they were selling was a whole lot more valuable than the cloth it was going on to, so you realized you had to learn to use a little less of it. But you don't want to use too little. So, how long have I been talking now?
25 minutes. 25
minutes. I'm talking too much because nobody's stopping me. I've gone from Adam and Eve to the 1900s in less than half an hour. We're going to get out of here quick today.
Make a comment, because I just happened to go there recently. If you go to Asheville, you go to Biltmore Estate. This is built in the early 1900s, but they have a laundry in the basement, and it had some of the equipment that you talked about.
Really?
Yeah. If you want to see that, it's at Biltmore Estate in Asheville.
I lived in Asheville, and I thought I was going to spend the rest of my life there. So the first 3 people that visited me, that's what they wanted to do, go to Biltmore Estates. Well, I was going to put it off till I could do it later. The good old United Merchants closed the plant about 2 months after I got there, so I never made it to see it. But anyway, the 1900s, incredible length of time without a heck of a lot happening. But I think it's another case of what we're facing today. Man was involved with all the original technological changes. When I say man, I mean men and women. But today, and later as we got more and more into the 20th century, technology was creating the new technology. And if you think it's happened fast in what we're talking about here, don't even look at what's happening today. It'll scare you to death. I was just at a seminar the other day where the fact came up that Rolex, from the time it started till the time it became the #1 watch selling in the world was, I forget how many years. Apple did it in 18 months. became the #1 watch seller in the world in 18 months. That's more than an old guy like me can handle. Please now, don't make me keep talking.
Well, Preston, I got one thing you were talking about on the vacuum slots. We installed one at a place I worked at in the early '80s. And we thought we had it all figured out, and you'll get into some of the improvements on the vacuums. But all of a sudden, we were shut down due to shading. We were putting finishes on, sucking off, and these were mostly synthetic, so you know, very little cotton. We pull off 40%. Mike might remember coming down there while we were running it. Well, everything's going great. We're saving finish cost. Everything coming out shaded on one side. We thought there were problems in the tenders with the heat flow. We were looking all over the place. One day my boss comes out and he's red-faced angry. He goes right to the vacuum slot and says, do any of you technical guys, and by the way, he was a UNC graduate too, and he always rubbed it in our faces, say, you technical guys see what's wrong here? We were looking.